At the end of August, Microsoft announced that it was retiring Visual Studio for Mac. They do offer alternatives, but what does this mean for C# development on Mac? What are the alternatives? In this video, we're going to work through what this announcement means, where you can go if you're on a Mac, and what this means for the future of C# development in general. Finally, I'll share my feelings and frustrations around this process. So let's jump right in and talk about what happened. Well, on August 30th, 2023, Microsoft announces that they are going to retire Visual Studio for Mac. And this was kind of an abrupt announcement. All of a sudden, it just was. And in fact, as a Microsoft MVP, I typically get some behind-the-scenes access and some advanced notice on things that are going to happen. I did not hear about this. Now, it turns out that I guess the Visual Studio for Mac specific MVPs may have heard about it early, but that was it. And so we're actually going to talk about it later. We're not even going to talk about it yet. There's going to be some conversations about this in the coming month. But this support for Visual Studio for Mac also ends August 31st, 2024, which is 1 year from the announcement. So Visual Studio for Mac is no longer going to be supported within 1 year of the announcement that they were going to retire it. So it's a pretty quick transition, especially for Microsoft. And between now and then, only critical bug fixes, security fixes, and Apple platform updates will be added into Visual Studio for Mac. Essentially, Visual Studio for Mac is done. Okay, so that's the announcement from Microsoft. You have 1 year to figure out where to go, and in that year, don't expect anything to really change about how VS for Mac works. There'll be no new quality of life updates, probably very little to any bug fixes, mostly just security fixes and updates to the Apple platform. For example, with the new version of iOS coming out, with a new version of the iPhone coming out, well, that's going to make some changes to how Xamarin works and how also Maui works. So let's talk first about what Microsoft says is the alternatives, because they're not saying stop developing on a Mac. In fact, they're saying that the future is bright for developing .NET on a Mac. Let's look at what they suggest for the alternatives. The first alternative is Visual Studio for Code, VS Code, with the new C# dev kit. Now, these are snippets right from their announcement. So I've copied and pasted so I didn't put words in their mouth. So they've got a new C# dev kit, which I've shown off on this channel, with VS Code that allows you to do a lot of really cool things with C# right in VS Code instead of having to go to Visual Studio. And at the time, people asked, well, why are we putting stuff into VS Code when we have Visual Studio? And the answer is because VS Code is cross-platform. It not only works on Windows, but also Mac and Linux the same way. So putting effort there seems like a good idea because it broadens the ability for developers to work on C# even if they're not on Windows, which is great. That's a great new feature. The C# dev kit is a nice new alternative or option. And with that, they have also added the .NET MAUI and Unity extensions for VS Code. So these extensions also continue to deepen what you can do in VS Code with C#, and that's great. Now, I do want to point out, so this is their first alternative, is to use these extensions with VS Code if you're on Mac. I do want to point out that, notice line number 2, it says these extensions are available in preview. So they're not yet released to what we call general availability. They're previews, as in they might not be fully functional. They might be buggy. There are some known kind of breaking bugs that happen every once in a while. The story around the extension working is, well, there's some major problems that happen significant number of times, but they fix it as quickly as possible. So it's still very much a preview version. A preview version is supposed to break. It's supposed to be unstable because you're trying to figure out where the bugs are, what the problems are, and then you fix them. So the first alternative to VS for Mac, which is a generally available solid platform, is VS Code with these extensions that aren't yet available for general availability. They're still unstable. They're still preview versions. So it's not a great option. Now they are committing to making these generally available as soon as possible. They are committing to putting more resources towards these. But when they killed VS for Mac, Visual Studio for Mac, they kind of put a timer on things. They have 1 year before Visual Studio for Mac is fully out of support. And there's not something yet fully in support from VS Code. So that's not great. I'm going to share my thoughts near the end. We're going to keep going with what Microsoft says are the alternatives. I'll probably interject a grumbling sentence or two in here, but we'll keep going. Number 2 for your alternatives is Visual Studio running on Windows in a virtual machine on Mac. So if you're on Mac, the second alternative is to install Windows somehow on a virtual machine, dual boot, whatever you want to do. But that's the alternate idea for working with Mac. Now, this is somewhat problematic because you still need to have a Mac to debug your iOS builds if you're using Xamarin or Maui. So there is still some things you have to do to cross that VM barrier, but you could run Windows. And number 3 is you could run Windows, again, in a virtual machine, but this time in the cloud. So that's kind of your options from Microsoft. These are the 3 they presented, and quite frankly, when I read these, I kind of laughed because these are not great options. In fact, this feels like someone was required to write good things and they didn't know what to say. That's what it feels like. Now, that's kind of a knee-jerk reaction, but this is not a great list of alternatives, especially since the first one, the best one, is not generally available, is in preview, and still has some significant bugs. So the alternative is go to Windows. Not a great look, okay? So that's the Microsoft's alternatives. We're going to talk about what this means in a minute, but they missed an alternative, okay? There's one that was kind of glaring, and in fact, pretty much anybody that knows the .NET ecosystem saw this missing alternative, and those that didn't know existed probably do now, but the one they forgot to mention is JetBrains Writer. Okay, so if you're not familiar, JetBrains is a company that builds an IDE for .NET called Writer. And Writer is cross-platform, means it works on Linux, on Mac, on Windows in a very similar manner. And so you can, with the same environment, build .NET apps on all 3 platforms. So if you're on VS for Mac, then JetBrains Writer is probably your best bet right now for a generally available IDE to work with .NET for Mac. Now, the reason why it's missing is because it's not from Microsoft. And we'll talk more about this in a minute. It does make sense they didn't mention it, but from one perspective, let's put it that way. So, but what is JetBrains Writer? Well, it's cross-platform. It's a full IDE. It has built-in ReSharper. So if you like ReSharper with Visual Studio, well, it's built into Writer because it's the same company that makes it. Now, to be clear, it is a paid product. There is not, with Visual Studio, we have the Community Edition, which is free to any individual or even small company, as long as the company makes less than $1 million of gross income and has 5 or less developers. So it's a pretty broad, permissive base of people who can work with Visual Studio for free. Whereas with JetBrains Writer, there are some exceptions. For example, I believe students can get a reduced cost, and open source can get it for free. Open source developers can get it for free, and a couple other things. Or open source maintainers. Sorry, there's a little bit of a difference there. But there are some discounts. And in fact, when the announcement for Visual Studio for Mac came out as, hey, we're getting rid of it, JetBrains took advantage of that in the best way possible and they offered a significant discount on Writer. I believe it's expired now, but they offered a discount for people who wanted to move over. Great marketing move to kind of take advantage of that in a way that is positive for the community. But I believe if you're in the US, I believe the cost for Writer is about $150 for the first year, and it goes down every year to the third year. I think the third year costs like $89 or $88, something like that per year from then on. So there's a per year cost for Writer, but it is an alternative that you could consider. So that's kind of what they missed, but that's another alternative for you if you're on Mac. So let's talk about why retire Visual Studio for Mac. What's the reasoning behind retiring VS for Mac? And this is, again, a quote right from Microsoft. It says, we're focusing our efforts on optimizing Visual Studio and the C# Dev Kit for VS Code. So the reasoning behind it from Microsoft's words is, hey, we've got Visual Studio Code with the Dev Kit, and Visual Studio for Mac. That's 3 different platforms we're maintaining that do the same thing. Now, Visual Studio for Mac and Visual Studio, those 2 things work on different platforms. And so we can't eliminate, say, Visual Studio for Mac and say we'll use Visual Studio because that's on Windows only. And so they chose to maintain Visual Studio Code with the plugins for C# Dev Kit in order to cover Mac and Linux. And therefore, Visual Studio for Mac was redundant. And so as a way to eliminate duplicate work, they're just focusing on the 2 platforms. And now you may ask the question, well, then why is Visual Studio still around? We'll get to that because there is a reason why that's not being eliminated. And no, it's not going anywhere. So let's talk about, there's a lot of stuff to cover. I'm going to get to my thoughts, but let's go first into why does Microsoft make .NET? And this is important to understand. It's really important to understand. And it's quite simple: to make money. And that, to some people that may feel, they may cringe at that. They may say, that's a horrible reason. No, it's not. This is how capitalism works. There's a reason why Microsoft invests money in .NET. There's a reason why they hire people and give them very good salaries to work on .NET. It's because they think that money will come back to them and more. They're making an investment that they hope will grow. And so that's the whole reason why Microsoft makes .NET, is to make money. Now, you may say, well, there's probably other reasons. Not really. There's one reason. And that's the whole reason Microsoft as a company exists, is to make money. They are not your friend. They are not a charity. They are not just some good guy who wants to give away free stuff. Their goal is to make money, the same as Apple, Google, Amazon, or your local mom and pop shop, or you. Like, your whole goal is to make money when you work at a job. So theirs is too. Now, there can be altruistic things around that, but the specific focus of Microsoft with .NET is to make money, which raises the question, where do they make money on .NET? Remember, if you have been working with Visual Studio for Mac or Visual Studio Community Edition or VS Code, then you've probably used the free version. Now, if you're in a business, sure, you've used a paid version, but if you're an individual developer, you've been probably using the free version. So where does Microsoft get the money to pay for the development of that free version? Visual Studio for Code is completely free. There is no kind of strings attached. Now, there is with the C# Dev Kit. We'll talk about that. But where do they make their money on .NET, on Visual Studio? Well, number one is Visual Studio licensing. And again, remember I said, most of you have probably used the free version. But if you're in a business that has more than 5 developers or makes more than $1 million gross a year, then you have to pay for Visual Studio Professional Edition licenses for everyone using Visual Studio. So that's the first place they make money. And then, of course, they also have Visual Studio Enterprise Again, these are for Windows, but they also had Visual Studio for Mac, and you pay for the licensing there. And so that's the first place they make money. It's the most direct way they make money on .NET that I can see, is that they have licensing for the tools they built. But there's more to it than that. They also make money on product tie-ins. For example, when you build on C#, the database you choose will probably be Microsoft SQL Server. That's a pretty common, if you're doing C#, you're doing SQL Server. That's a pretty common connection. Well, Microsoft owns that, and you pay licensing fees, a lot of licensing fees, in order to use Microsoft SQL Server. The same with Azure. It works well in Azure. So the two are more easily tied together. And if you notice, when it comes to working with Visual Studio, and you go to publish, now it's a very easy tie-in to publish to Azure and to set up your CI/CD process right in Visual Studio. And it's done for you, and it helps you publish to Azure in a very easy way, and you can get up and running in minutes. Why? Well, because they own Azure, and they make money when you use Azure. Now, you can use it with AWS, no problem. But they don't make as much money there, because unless you're using Microsoft SQL Server, which, by the way, still pays licensing back to Microsoft, but unless you're using Microsoft-type products that have licenses on AWS, you're not really giving them any money. So the product tie-ins give them indirect income. Now, it's more significant income probably, but it's more indirect. It's not when you use C#, you give us this money. It's more like when you use C#, you'll probably also use these other products which do give us money. So there's a little more indirect link there. And yes, this is important to know when we start evaluating why Microsoft makes decisions and what decisions they may make in the future. So let's keep going. Number 3, they do make money on consulting with .NET. So they have a consulting arm that helps businesses work on the latest version of .NET or upgrade to the latest version of .NET or convert their applications over to .NET and so on. So there is some money there, but really also is about tie-ins with Azure and SQL and all the other things that they make. And then finally, this is the one that's the least connected to the dollars, but it's reputation. So how does Microsoft make money on .NET because of a reputation? Well, .NET has been around since 2001, 2002. That has been a consistent language that has been consistently maintained and consistently supported for over 20 years. If you look at the industry, there are very few languages that are like that. There are very few systems where you can say, hey, it's 20-year-old code, but it's still supported and it still runs. I mean, you think about, Angular, React, Vue. These are just babies. They have not been around that long. They've consistently made breaking changes year after year, it seems like. So if you try to get the same Angular code to work that existed 10 years ago, well, first of all, I don't think Angular existed 10 years ago, but if you did, it wouldn't work. So C# has been a consistent voice when it comes to big business. And we're not talking about companies that make a few $1 million. We're talking about companies that make a few $1 billion or more. When they decide to make decisions about what to build their applications on, what to build their business on, what to bank on, what to, risk their business on, they're going to want the least risk possible. They're going to want something that is consistent, that is going to be there the long term, that's going to have the backing of a big company. It's going to not just change with the latest fad. Well, that reputation is important because having a reputation of being here for the long run is going to make a positive impact. This is why the Silverlight thing is still so frustrating. Now, Silverlight, Microsoft really didn't make any incorrect moves when it came to shutting it down, except how they communicated it. I have a whole video on Silverlight. You can go watch that. and we can break it down. But they didn't really have a choice about shutting it down, but they should have communicated it better. And to this day, they still hear about it. Reputation matters. Even if the person who is viewing it misunderstands the situation, reputation still matters. And so with .NET, they've had the reputation of being a long-term player in the market who consistently maintains and upgrades their products in a way that is consistent. Even if you don't like all the moves they make, even if you think they should do things differently, they've been around for a very long time and still support things a long way back. And that's even the problem with Windows, is Windows still supports things that were around 20 years ago. In fact, I heard something the other day, if you think about it, you don't even think about it really, but if you open an Excel file from, 1997, it would still open in the latest version of Excel. That's incredible. That's backward compatibility. That's really impressive. That's a reputation. And so that reputation allows companies to say, yes, I'll put my spreadsheets in Excel because I know it'll be here tomorrow and a year from now and 10 years from now. That's a bit of a problem going forward. We're going to talk about that. But this is how Microsoft makes money on .NET. They make it directly on licensing for Visual Studio. They make it on product tie-ins. They do some with consulting, and they bring more companies to them because of their reputation for longevity. So that's where Microsoft makes their money. I want you to keep that in your mind. Now let's talk about my observations. First of all, Visual Studio isn't going anywhere. I've already said that once, but here's why. This is Visual Studio for Windows. Okay, Visual Studio for Mac, unfortunately, is gone. But Visual Studio isn't going anywhere because it still supports WinForms and WPF and technically WinUI, but that's really not going to be long for this world. So it still supports things that businesses use. There is not a good alternative. VS for Code does not have an alternative for Windows Forms development or for WPF. So you can't really, depend on VS Code to get that plugin. And you might think, well, maybe they're making a plugin for it. I don't think they are, because of the fact that that plugin would not work on Mac or Linux. And that's against everything VS Code stands for. The reason why it would not work on Mac or Linux, at least in the current state, is because of the fact that Windows Forms and Windows Presentation Foundation, also known as WPF, the reason why they have Windows in the name is because they directly rely on the operating system being Windows. There's certain DLLs and other things they depend on in Windows in order to render and run. So if you tried to run that on Mac or Linux, it would not work. It wouldn't even render, which means you couldn't even render the UI. Now, I do want to put an asterisk here because that's not fully true. There can be a way to run WPF and other platforms, but just ask like Uno and Avalonia. They take WPF and WinUI, I believe, and run them cross-platform, on the web. But that's kind of beside the point. That's not what Microsoft can do or has done yet. But so that's the first thing. Visual Studio isn't going anywhere because of those things. Number two, VS Code is a good option for Mac and Linux. It is a good option. Now, again, it's the plugins are in preview. They're still being updated. They're still trying to get up to speed and fix the bugs. And you're still going to have some quirkiness over the next few months. I would hope in the next 6 months, you will see that kind of solidify and be kind of done with the major problems. I would hope it'd have 6 months of GA, general availability for the plugins before they turn off Visual Studio for Mac, but we'll see. This seems rushed. This is a really rushed situation. In fact, if you, I didn't look up the actual dates on it, but I believe it was in June or so, May or June, when the C# Dev Kit came out, and it was later that the Unity Kit and the .NET MAUI Kit came out. And, so it hasn't been that long since they've even existed, since they even were, a preview 0.1 type version. And now all of a sudden they are the best solution for Mac development with C#. That seems rushed. It seems like, and I am extrapolating, I do not have any insider knowledge at all in the situation, but it feels like someone said in a meeting, maybe in January, we're going to kill VS for Mac. You need to figure out an alternative and build it now. And a couple people, threw stuff together and got something working and rushed it out the door, kind of breathlessly. Here's something. And they immediately started pulling the trigger on killing VS for Mac. That's what it feels like. It feels rushed. Now, was it rushed? Well, yes, it was, especially since it's going away in a year and they don't have a general availability replacement for it. So yes, it's rushed. And I think this comes at a bad time for MAUI. MAUI is still struggling to get up to speed. So, we'll talk about this separately, but .NET MAUI was supposed to come out with .NET 6. And it didn't make the cut. It didn't have enough time, and so they put it out of band with .NET 6 about, I think, 6 or 7 months later. And so we've only had, .NET 7 where it's been an official release with the rest of .NET, and they've been bug fixing. They've been trying to make significant performance improvements and significant bug fixes for .NET 8. So MAUI is still kind of in the new product settling phase, even though it really isn't a new product because it really is just Xamarin redone. But it still comes at a bad time for MAUI because this really hurts MAUI development on Mac. And MAUI already needed all the help it could get. And now there's one less option for Mac. And so this comes at a bad time for MAUI. So my thoughts, Microsoft needs to share a better why. Okay, that's my thought. My thought is that Microsoft can have whatever vision it decides it needs for .NET. But they should probably share a better why about why they are making choices they are. And not just saying, well, we're optimizing for two different IDEs, VS Code and Visual Studio. That's not a good enough why. There's got to be a longer term strategy there, or there's got to be a better transition from one to the other than there has been. So I do think this comes down to money. I think that right now, and we'll talk more about it in a minute, but I think right now Microsoft is trying to cut down their expenses. Because again, what's Microsoft's goal? Well, Microsoft's goal is to make money. And they have been doing layoffs. They have been doing other things to cut back their expenses. And I think if they looked at, we're supporting VS Code and we're supporting Visual Studio for Mac, and we're supporting Visual Studio for Windows, that's a lot of things to support. Let's see if we can reduce one of those options. I don't think it really reduced a whole lot, but maybe it did. But I think that's the reason, it all comes down to let's spend less money on this. But I don't think that's a great why either. If there's the idea that, hey, we're going to put more resources towards these two as opposed to spraying out over three, that'd be great. I'm a little concerned that's not what they're doing. They're cutting out a third of the resources. That's what it feels like. So the same amount of resources goes to VS Code that went to before. It's just now, there's not a third option. That's what it feels like. But again, this is an outsider talking. I don't know for sure. Let's talk frequently asked questions. Why are there licensing fees on the C# Dev Kit? This gets tossed out a lot. There shouldn't be licensing fees. VS Code is free, so why should the plugin not be free? OmniSharp was free, so why can't we? Remember, how does Microsoft make money? With .NET, it makes money. The primary way is on licensing. Again, Microsoft is a for-profit company. If they're not making money somewhere, then they're not going to do it. So I think it's actually important they do put a price tag on this. They do apply licensing fees. And again, those licensing fees are the same as Visual Studio licensing fees, and the fact that it's free for individual users and free for companies up to 5. It's the same licensing, I believe, as Visual Studio. So really, honestly, I don't have a problem with the licensing fees on the C# Dev Kit. They're not trying to, do anything underhanded. They're being very clear about it. This costs money to maintain. If you want it, you have to pay for it. And, so that, I've seen some people, and it really kills me. They say, well, I'm not going to pay for the C# Dev Kit. I go to Writer. Cool. That's great. And if you love Writer, awesome. Go for it. But you're still paying for it. And why? Because JetBrains needs to make money too. And so really this comes down to, this is not, this comes back to our open source argument from before, and we talked about open source with the mock issue. But, it's not about free everything. People don't work for free. That's just not how it works for the most part. There are some generous people who have given things generously, but that does not mean you should require it or expect it. And so when a company whose job it is to make profit and whose investors are saying you must make profit, when a company makes something, they need to make money on it. And so, yes, we're going to get licensing fees on the C# Dev Kit. So why isn't Microsoft talking about Writer? Again, go back to point 1. Why are they charging licensing fees? Because they make money on this. This is how they make money on .NET. This is one of the most direct ways. And to be clear, when you make money, when it's very easy to see the money coming in, it's very easy to quantify. So if I sell tomatoes for $1 a tomato, that's probably expensive. But if I sell tomatoes for $1 a tomato and I give you 3 tomatoes and you give me $3, it's very easy to see that transaction. And so it's very easy to say, I made $3. But if instead I give you 3 tomatoes and you don't give me anything in return, but you take that tomatoes and turn it into tomato sauce and you sell it at your restaurant, and then from that, people who are, at the restaurant hear about my tomatoes and come and buy my tomatoes, and then I make money, that's a little more indirect. And it's harder to see the benefit of giving you free tomatoes. So the most clear thing is I give you something, you give me money. The more indirect it gets, the harder it is to quantify, is this really beneficial? So when it comes to Visual Studio for Code, Visual Studio Code, or even Visual Studio, the licensing fee is the most direct. I give you something, you give me cash. And so it's a very clear line in a budget. So a person who has no understanding about .NET or programming or anything, but who's an accountant and looking at the books, can say Visual Studio licensing brought in $1 million. Therefore, .NET has made us at least $1 million. So that's a very clear relationship, as opposed to maybe the $10 million or $50 million that was influenced by C# and what percentage of that, is from .NET. So why don't he talk about Writer? Well, because that's taking away from the most direct way they have to associate income with .NET. It's their competitor. It's why doesn't, Apple talk positively about the new Google Pixel phone? Well, because that's their competitor. Like, that takes money out of their pockets. If Apple came on stage for their Apple announcements and said, you know what, this Google phone is amazing. And you know what, for certain circumstances, go for this one instead. Or, you know what, these are both kind of the same. It's kind of up to you to choose. Do you like the Google phone or the Apple phone? Cool, go for it. That doesn't make sense. So yes, it doesn't make sense necessarily they're talking about Writer because they don't get a cut of that. So that's why they don't talk about Writer. Is it the right move? I'm not arguing that it is. I think they should probably mention Writer. I really do. But I understand from a purely business standpoint, a purely accounting standpoint, why they might not want to talk about the fact that Writer is an alternative. Why now? So that's a great question, and it's a question that I can't give you a solid answer on, but my assessment is that it's a cost-cutting measure. And they're doing cost cutting, and so they're saying, hey, this is one area they can start doing cost cutting in. And these things don't happen overnight. It's not like they woke up on August 30th in the morning and say, hey, you know what? Let's kill VS for Mac, and did it by the afternoon. That's not what happened. This has probably been in discussion for 6-8 months at least. I would assume that this discussion came out in the turn of the year, or there, something around there where they said, hey, you know what? This is something we should work towards. Because it took time for them to build up the C# dev kit and the .NET MAUI extension for that and the Unity extension for that. So I think that's probably what it is, but I don't know for sure. And are they reverting to bad Microsoft? So I have gone through the kind of the gamut of Microsoft as a developer. I started developing when it was Windows 3.1. Yes, that's been a while. Actually, we're developing DOS, but professionally, I started in Windows 3.1, and I have seen Microsoft be the bad Microsoft, and so they worked hard to, for example, kill Netscape Navigator, and Internet Explorer was kind of like this behemoth that tried to crush all the competition. And they do the same thing with .NET. We even had Steve Ballmer from Stage talking about how he hated Linux and how he wanted to get rid of Linux. And they've changed that tune. They've opened up. They've embraced open source, and they have contributed significantly to open source. They have, they bought GitHub and they made it better. They didn't just, make it only Microsoft stuff. They made it better. And they have added more things to it, and they've really improved it. And they have looked at .NET and said, hey, we can make this even better. And they made it cross-platform. And all these other things they've done to really embrace the community and say, you know what, instead of doing our own closed source thing, we're going to embrace things like gRPC, which are community-wide, and WebAssembly, which again is community-wide, not just Microsoft, and WebSockets, which are community-wide and not just Microsoft's protocol. And so they've done these things to really open up and say, hey, we are a part of the global developer community, not trying to create a walled garden inside of it. And so the question is, are they reverting back to bad Microsoft? Well, the messaging where they said, hey, either use the preview version on VS Code or use Windows, that wasn't great messaging, because that does come across as, we're going to push you back to Windows, and we're going to push you to use what we license, which is Windows, instead of trying to get you to, use whatever is best for you. That's not really what they're doing here. Firstly, because Windows is no longer their primary focus. That's why Windows no longer costs what it used to cost. It used to be very, very expensive, and now it's basically free. But that's not really what they're doing here. They are focusing on money. They are making choices that I disagree with, and they are making choices that are maybe a little more short-sighted than they should have, and they are not communicating well enough about what their overall strategy is. But I don't think that they are reverting back to bad Microsoft. I think this could be a step in that direction if they so choose to make it. But I think that right now we don't know if they're making that step or if they're just not communicating the better step they are making. So I don't think so. I don't think they're reverting to bad Microsoft, but I do think they are tightening their belt. And that does mean that they are reducing what they give to the community and what they provide to the community with their product. So then what does this mean for MAUI? MAUI has been kind of an afterthought, it feels like. MAUI's been something where they have not invested the amount of resources that I wish they had. In fact, I feel like they invest more resources in talking about MAUI than they do in building MAUI. That's what it feels like. And MAUI has not progressed as fast as we would have liked. MAUI is not as complete as we would have liked. And there's a number of people who are working with MAUI more in depth that are, concerned. about how Maui is progressing. And so this is a blow for Maui. It's not Microsoft signaling that Maui is going away. That's not what it's signaling. But it is a unintentional, I think, blow for Maui and for that Maui community, because it is going to make things a little harder at first to work with Maui. Now, again, the Maui tools for VS Code are coming along. They are making progress in that, and you do have a year still on Visual Studio for Mac. So hopefully this doesn't have too big of a negative impact. It's more of a PR issue than necessarily an actual programming issue or a showstopper. But it's still something they need to address, because I think that otherwise it could be have a negative impact for Maui. Okay, so what are my thoughts? I mean, I think you can probably tell I'm a little frustrated. Change without vision is unsettling. And that's what we've got right here. We have a change to, retiring Visual Studio for Mac, but we don't have a vision for it. We don't have the reason for it. We don't have the long-term positive goal. This, the one statement, hey, we're trying to focus more on Visual Studio and VS Code. That's not a great vision. That's not a compelling story. So if we saw they're putting more resources toward those things and it was clear that they were doing that, maybe. But just saying, this is what we're doing is more marketing speak, PR speak, than it is real vision. So this is an unsettling time. I can see that. I'm a little frustrated by how they communicate it. In my mind, this is not necessarily a big issue with what they did. It's more about how they did it. This is about the lack of vision, the lack of clarity around why we're doing it, the speed at which they did it, the seeming disregard for how this might affect people. That's what frustrates me more than what they did to actually kill VS for Mac. Because Visual Studio for Mac always lagged behind. It was always lagging behind the other versions. And so, yes, if you're going to invest in VS Code, then I don't understand why you would also invest in Visual Studio for Mac, which is a one platform specific, as opposed to just making a cross-platform app like VS Code. But I would wish they would have done it in a more thoughtful manner, in a more clear manner, and not just drop the hammer that as of today, we're no longer putting any new features in VS for Mac. That seemed a little hasty and unsettling. Okay, number 2, actions speak louder than words, even if it's not what you mean. So oftentimes big companies, they run all their words through PR departments and marketing departments and lawyers and all these other departments to try and, tweak the wording and make sure the wording is correct and make sure that the messaging is correct. So we're very, very clear about what we're saying. And, that can be good, because then you don't have, half-baked ideas getting out in the public and things they didn't really believe, but it sounds like they believe getting out there. But your actions speak louder than that, because everybody knows that you're trying to have marketing and lawyers and all the rest go through your words. So what you do matters. If what you do does not align with what you say, then we're not going to believe what you say. We're going to believe what you do. This is important to know for anybody. So if you tell me, I'm the best basketball player in the world, but you can't make a jump shot, well, your actions speak louder than your words. You've kind of negated what you said. And with this situation, Microsoft is communicating something differently with their actions than they are with their words. And so when we see the actions of immediately kill Visual Studio for Mac, I mean, yes, they have a year of technically support, but that support is no changes, no bug fixes except for critical bug fixes, which let's be clear here, probably is not going to be that many. That's not really giving us any time. That's just immediately retiring something or immediately deprecating something. And that's a pretty abrupt thing. And they say, well, the future's bright with, VS Code. Well, yes, it probably is, but it's something that, we need to see with how you do things rather than just hear from your words. .NET, C#, and Visual Studio are all solid and have bright futures. So yes, this can be a negative for the community. This can be a negative for how you feel about how Microsoft treats some of the community or how they view people on Mac. Although I don't think that's necessarily what they were trying to communicate, but you can feel that way. But overall, C#, .NET, Visual Studio, these all have solid and bright futures ahead of them. This is not a signal that Microsoft is trying to go away from any of these. Microsoft is invested in these things. It's just that they are cutting budget in a way that is less than well communicated. It's very unclear why they did what they did. I think it's because of budget, but I think that they needed to communicate that more clearly rather than just, pull the stunt they did. Okay, but I definitely still believe that .NET and C# and Visual Studio have a solid and bright future. And yes, I have been around long enough to have seen companies that have burned out. I have seen companies that have crashed and burned. I have seen companies that have, made decisions like this and move forward. And I think that this is what I see from Microsoft. I do not see a wavering in .NET or C# or Visual Studio for Windows. Okay, I think this is more about finances rather than about Windows only direction. I don't think this is a return to Microsoft saying Windows is the only way. I really don't see that. I really think this is more a accountant change rather than a strategic development change. I think is how I see this. So this is more about them cutting budget rather than about trying to be Windows only or something like that. So that's what happened. That's what the situation is. That's what my thoughts are. Yeah, I'm not thrilled. I'm not, Microsoft could have done a much better job at this, and I will be communicating that to them, especially even with this video. I'm communicating that with them. They could have done a better job with this. But I think that, there is a lot to look forward to. There's a lot of positive things, but there's also, we have to make sure that we make wise choices with how we develop and what we choose to do. And, that's one of the things that I have looked at with Maui is I have chosen not to start building apps on videos too much with Maui. But I'm waiting for that stability to come. And I'm waiting for them to kind of, settle that down and really invest in that. And so there's things like that where we make a wise choice. And if you think about it from a company's perspective, a company has to think about 10, 20 years, not just the next year. And so that reputation we talked about before is important. And it's something that you have to think about when you choose any tool, not just a .NET tool, or not just a Microsoft tool, any tool. You have to think about the reputation, the long-term viability. And, a lot of times you have to make a best guess based upon what you know. There's not a guarantee from anybody about what the future holds. And so we just have to, learn from the past and make decisions in the future based upon that. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm disappointed in how Microsoft handled this. Okay, so that's my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Just a thought though, if you come at me with the C# is dead or, .NET is horrible and it can never be used, and you're going to get some real significant pushback from me because that's just not true. But I would love to know your thoughts and concerns. I'd love to know what you would like to hear from Microsoft or what you would appreciate knowing from Microsoft. Also, if you think that this should all just be free, that's not a viable choice either, because that's when it goes away. Because again, Microsoft is there to make money, just like every other company. Okay, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.